Hi. In this video lesson, we're going to talk about graphic vocabulary and how you would use it in telling your story in comic books or cartoons, because there's a lot of overlap in both of those. So let's define the phrase graphic vocabulary by breaking it down into its parts. The word graphic means drawn as opposed to written. Words are grammatical. Pictures and drawings are graphic. The word vocabulary, you've probably heard in school, is the list of words that you know the meaning of. But more completely, it's the list of words that you know the meaning of and that you use. So you might have a word that you know the meaning of, but if you never say it, you never write it, you never use it, is it really part of your vocabulary? So putting that together, graphic vocabulary is the list not of words that we know the meaning of and that we use, but of drawings or parts of drawings, of illustrations that we use. And I've always thought of them as being like the adverbs of a drawing. And an adverb is a word that describes an adjective, a verb, or another adverb. So in the following sentence, which gives us the most amount of information? He ran. He ran quickly. He ran very quickly. Well, the third one does. Not only is it telling us what he's doing, he's running, but how is he running? Quickly. How quickly? Very quickly. So it gives us the most amount of information and adds to what we understand what's going on. So it's kind of like that in the cartoons and comic books. So there's different categories of graphic vocabularies that you can read. And I use the term read because some of it is actually reading. So let's talk about the first one, the first category, in my observation, in my opinion, after all these years of studying how to do this. The first one is sound, the different ways that you can convey sound in a cartoon or comic book, because your paper doesn't actually make the sound. If you have part of your story where a sound is happening, whatever that sound is, people aren't going to listen to the page to actually hear it. You have to imply it with what you put on the page. And the first one is sound effects. So in comic books and cartoons, you see this all the time: boom, bang, crash, kaplow. A lot of times you'll use what's called onomatopoeia, which is to say that a word is written and spelled in such a way that it reminds the reader of the sound it's trying to define. There's lots of them that we use all the time, even though, and sometimes even make their way into normal conversation. For example, the word zipper, to zip up a jacket. Why is it called a zipper? Because it actually makes that sound. Buzz, buzz sounds like buzz, buzz. The word growl sounds like growl. It sounds like growl. Don't shake the table. So, you crash. If you drop something and it breaks, crash. It actually has that onomatopoeic sound to it. So a lot of times when you're doing sound effects in a cartoon or comic book, you can even make up words, of course, you can think of an onomatopoeia word to emulate that idea that this is the sound I want people to hear in their mind when they're reading these words. The next one is dialogue, and it's just that. It's when people are speaking out loud, usually to each other. They're talking, saying something, shouting, whispering, whatever it may be, but talking is the dialogue, we'll call it. So if you have people that are talking to each other, usually you have word balloons. People could be shouting, hey. People could be whispering. That's all done in perhaps how you render the lettering, but we'll talk about that later. And then you have thought balloons. You see this in comic books and cartoons. And thought balloons are the little cloud-like and bubbly ones that come up out of their heads, where we're able to hear what the character is thinking. Does this happen in real life? No, but in comic books and in cartoons, a lot of times they want to have an inner monologue of what's going on, what the character is thinking. Thought balloons would allow you to do that. Then you come to captions. And captions are sort of the equivalent of the narrator in a television or movie. You have a person who's not part of the story, who's not a character in the story, but is telling you about the story, things that are going on in the story. A very stereotypical one in the old days, you'd have a little caption that says, "Meanwhile, back at the ranch." Things like that. So you can actually have captions that will give us information about the story, even though it's coming from a source that is not in the story. And then you have signage, and signage is just that. It's things that you would read that would be written in the story. So that can be very useful in telling the story as well. If I draw a background and there's a building, and it's sort of just a building with some windows and doors, and people are walking by, you go, well, that's a nice background, but it doesn't quite give us as much information as if I put a sign that said, the bowling alley, the post office, Joe's barber shop. Instead of just a building, it's a very specific building. It's a very certain location. It's a little more defined for the reader. That can be useful. You can also see it sometimes on other things besides buildings, of course, but like even trucks. If I draw a sort of large delivery truck, and it's, you know, in the story, and it's like, well, it's a delivery truck, but if it says, you know, Frank's Bread, you're like, oh, that's a very specific kind of delivery truck. It's coming from Frank's Bakery to deliver the bread. Or U.S. Army, or, you know, whatever it may be, mail truck. You can actually make it much more specific. So those are things that you literally read as words. The sound effects, dialogue, thought, caption, and then signage. These are actually using letters and words in the story to emulate the idea that people are speaking, creating sound, and so forth. Then you come to the next category of graphic vocabulary, which is movement. Again, just like your page, the literal paper page doesn't give off sound, it's not moving, it's not animated. You have to imply that motion. One of the most common ones you'll see, especially in American comic books, is motion lines. These are the lines kind of trailing out behind a character or an object as it runs and flies and shoots through the air and things like that. So speed lines or motion lines are probably what you've seen before. Then you have vibration lines, and these are a little bit different because the object or the character is staying in place but moving very quickly, kind of twitching back and forth. It'd be the difference between a bee flying across the image and a bee's wings vibrating as it flaps back and forth at a high rate of speed. So that would be different ways of showing pardon me, motion lines with speed lines or vibration lines. Then you have photographic blur, and this is kind of a phrase that I've used. I don't know, I haven't seen other people use it, but it's what I call. And this is what you put behind a character to show that they're moving and you're kind of in motion with them, but that you're moving by the background very quickly. An example would be if you and I were in a moving vehicle, and like a car, and you're driving and I'm the passenger. If I looked over at you, I would see you in focus because we're both moving at the same speed in the car. But through the open window, I would see the background kind of in a blurry effect passing by us. Another example might be if we were sitting on a kid's merry-go-round in the playground at opposite ends and we were spinning at high speed, we would look at each other and see each other, but the background would appear to be very blurry as it spun by us around us. So that would be photographic blur. You find that actually quite commonly, or at least it's more common nowadays in American comic books, but it was very prevalent in manga for many years, and then it kind of made its way and became more popular, I think, in this part of the world because of that. Then you have a dust cloud, another way of showing quick motion. This one's a bit more cartoony, and you would see this in the old Chuck Jones cartoons where the Roadrunner would take off and there would be literally a dust cloud left behind. That can be sort of a graphic symbol for the character ran away very quickly, disappeared, and just left a cloud of dust. Again, not necessarily the most realistic or something that you might see in a story that you're trying to convey something realistically or dramatically, but more cartoony, a little more comedic effect. And then the other one is after image. And this is the character or the object is moving so fast that it's leaving an after image trail on our eye. You would see this in American comics anyways, sometimes with the Flash. He would be running so fast that he would leave a trail of images behind him. You've seen it in other comics, but I think more people would recognize it in the Flash, if that makes sense. So that's movement, to imply movement in a static drawing. You want people to look at your panel, to look at your drawings and your comic books and your cartoons and go, oh, that thing or that person has moved very quickly or has moved at all. And that would be graphic vocabulary elements that you could use to convey that idea. Now the third one is what I call atmospherics, and what I mean by that is the feeling, the atmosphere of what was going on, a physical feeling in the story, in that scene, in that panel. And the first one is heat. If you have something that's hot, you want to indicate to the reader that, oh, okay, that object is hot in the story. Your paper, your drawing, isn't going to radiate heat. They're not going to touch the paper and say, wow, that part of the drawing was hot. You have to show them with a graphic vocabulary element that it's hot. And there's wavy lines and there's various things that you can do in different ways to show that a thing is hot. There's a big difference between a slice of pizza and a hot slice of pizza. The next one is light. Things are giving off light. They're shining, they're illuminating very brightly. You can do that by showing the shadows cast by objects around this object giving off the light. But sometimes in comic books you want to show that it's incandescent. It's giving off light itself, and there's ways to do that. And then this one's kind of unusual because it wouldn't be something you would see in real life perhaps, but in comic books, it's power, energy, things radiating off in a very energetic way. And you have these streaky lines, you have Kirby crackle, the dots shooting off and sort of evaporating off of it. In comic books, we look at that convention and go, yes, I understand what's going on, that makes sense. In real life, if you saw something like that, it probably wouldn't make as much sense, presumably. But in comic books, it convey the idea that something is just seething with power. It's very energetic. It's over the top. Then we come to the next one, dampness, to show that a scene is damp, that it's moist, that it's humid. That would be an atmospheric that you might try to convey in the story. And then you have smell. Hopefully your pages don't smell. Your comic books don't actually smell. But if you wanted to show that there was smell, either good or bad, there's ways to do that with your graphic vocabulary as well. There's a big difference between a shoe and a stinky shoe. There's a big difference between a cold pizza and a pizza giving off aroma. You walk in and go, who made the pizza? And there's others. I mean, if you can think of a atmospheric condition, you could find a way to try to show that in your comic book, in your story, presumably. So this is the video on graphic vocabulary. I tend to kind of think of graphic vocabulary elements as, again, being like an adverb. It's adding to the story, but it's not the main part of the story. It actually is adding a little bit of extra information so readers can more easily enjoy and completely understand what's happening in the story, presumably. So I have a little bit of a homework assignment for everybody out there. I'm assuming that if you're watching this, you have an interest in cartoons and comic books and things of that nature. Read a comic book the next time you pick up your comic book, or read a cartoon, perhaps a cartoon strip in the newspaper, and look at it and see if you can spot all the elements of graphic vocabulary, the speed lines, the vibration lines, the heat lines, the this, the that, and go, okay, yeah, that you're right, that actually does tell me what's going on. Now imagine if the artist had forgotten to put that part in. Would the story make as much sense? If the person is holding up a stinky shoe with stinky wave lines coming off of it, but they'd forgotten to draw that in, and the person is just holding a shoe, would the story have as much effect? Would it be as understandable, and would it convey as much meaning in that? And then you might start to realize, oh no, graphic vocabulary can be a very, very essential, very important part of my storytelling. So when I want to tell my story in cartoons and comic books, knowing how to do that with these elements of graphic vocabulary would be a good thing to use, would be a good thing to have in my arsenal, in my toolkit. So that's this video on graphic vocabulary. If you have any kind of questions, feel free to message me or comment them in the posts. Hope everybody's staying safe out there, and we'll talk again soon. Bye.